Howdy, it's Kyle talking about various terms that we use to describe people from Spanish-speaking places or descendants of people from Spanish-speaking places. There are many terms that can often get kind of confusing, so in this video I'm going to talk about these terms and which ones may or may not be used properly, and also mention a term that is rarely used but I do think is much more appropriate. And also I'm going to be talking about the specific case of my dad because he is part of a group that I'm going to be discussing in this video. As of the 2020 census, the largest minority group in the U.S. is Hispanic or Latino at approximately 19%. But I wanted to show the demographic profile of my hometown in Central California to give an idea of just how confusing some of these terms can be. So you look at this demographic profile here and you can see that it's 66% white alone, and you go down toward the bottom and it's 52% Hispanic or Latino, and then 38% white alone, not Hispanic or Latino. So you look at the discrepancy of white alone, not Hispanic, and white alone, there's a 28% difference there. So many people who are Hispanic consider themselves just to be white. And this might be a throwback to older censuses where you weren't allowed to be mixed race and you weren't allowed to say Hispanic, you had to be just white, black, Asian, or Native American. And that's going to be a big part of what I'm talking about in this video because Hispanic or Latino is not a race. The first term that I'm going to talk about is Latino or Latina, or the wonderfully named Latinx or Latinx. The term Latino simply references being from Latin America, and as you can see from this map, it's basically the entire Western Hemisphere outside of the US and Canada. There is some debate whether or not the English and Dutch-speaking islands of the Caribbean are part of Latin America, but I'm not going to be getting into that kind of specific for this video. The biggest issue with the term Latino is that many Latin American countries are not Spanish-speaking, most notably Brazil, which is Portuguese-speaking. The three small countries just north of Brazil include Guyana, which is English-speaking, Suriname, which is Dutch-speaking, and French Guiana, which is French-speaking, and that's not actually a country, it's part of France. And you also have the small Central American nation of Belize, which is also English-speaking. So somebody from Brazil would be considered Latino, although I'm not sure a Brazilian in the US would refer to themselves as Latino. And growing up in a town where more than half of the people are Mexican, I rarely, if ever, heard them refer to themselves as Latino. But overall, I think the term Latino is improperly used because it's just too geographically inclusive. Usually we're referencing people that are coming from Spanish-speaking places, and many of those places, again, are not Spanish-speaking. The next term that I want to talk about is Hispanic. This term is used more widely than Latino and simply references people that are coming from a place that speaks Spanish. But isn't that what this video is supposed to be? Shouldn't it end right now? Shouldn't Hispanic be the only term that we use? There are a couple of issues with this term. First of all, it also includes the country of Spain. And this also includes the South American nations of Argentina and Uruguay, both of which are predominantly white. The people are mostly descendants of Spaniards or Italians. Even though Hispanic is not a race, the term is often used to describe race, so I don't think people from Spain, Argentina, or Uruguay would be considered Hispanic in the US because they are basically white folks. Another issue with the term Hispanic is that not everybody in these Spanish-speaking nations speaks Spanish. There's a large indigenous population in southern Mexico and Guatemala, as well as the South American nations Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. So if someone who is 100% indigenous from southern Mexico emigrates to the US, are they Hispanic? And another issue with the term is that the vast majority of Hispanics are mixed race. So very, very few people are just Hispanic. Which leads me to the term that I do believe is much more appropriate to use to describe some of these people. It's a term I've rarely heard at all and almost never heard in the media, and the term is mestizo. This is an actual term you can look up on dictionary.com, and it simply means a mix of European and Native American ancestry. And for the vast majority of Hispanics in the US, the European side is going to be Spanish. This map highlights the countries in which the majority of the people that live there are classified as mestizo. So what this means is that if you are Hispanic, you are almost certainly part indigenous. But how people can look as a result can be a pretty wide range of skin tones. There can be people that are much more European than indigenous, and people that are much more indigenous than European. With most Hispanics in the US being of Mexican, Puerto Rican, or Central American origin, most are going to be mestizo. But why is this term rarely, if ever, used in the US if it's an appropriate term to use? I'm not sure why this is the case, but my hypothesis is that with mestizo being a term that references people who are of mixed European and Native American ancestry, the parallel term for people that are of mixed European and African ancestry is mulatto. And for some reason, somewhere along the way, the term mulatto became maybe an offensive term or perhaps slang. But someone like Obama is a mulatto. It just simply means you're mixed European and African ancestry. So, maybe with that term being considered perhaps slightly, offensive, that maybe mestizo being a parallel term for that is also considered offensive. I don't know. That's my hypothesis. So if we're talking about people who are of mixed Spanish and African ancestry, we're talking a lot about Cuba and Dominican Republic. Cuba is a very racially integrated country with most people being part white, part indigenous, and part black. And as a result, skin tones in Cuba can range from as white as me to somebody who is as dark skinned as somebody who is 100% African. But this is just another example how almost all Hispanics in the US are mixed race. Basically, the only Hispanics in the US that are not mixed race are going to be recent immigrants from Spain, Argentina, or Uruguay, and there really aren't that many of those in the US. So now I want to talk about a small group of people that lives primarily in the north-central part of New Mexico or south-central Colorado and a little bit into northeastern Arizona, and these are not Hispanics, but Hispanos. These are people that trace their ancestry back to the original Spanish invaders back in the 17th century. From a racial and ethnicity standpoint, these people are no different than other mestizos in the US, such as most Mexicans, but there is a contingency within these people that insist they are 100% white. And although most Hispanos do recognize the fact that they do have some indigenous blood in them, there are some that are really quite adamant that no, we are 100% white. And there really is almost an air of white supremacy with some of the people within this group, and it can be kind of disturbing because face it, your family has been there for 400 years. Somebody at some point hooked up with somebody who's indigenous. So this idea that, no, we're not these dirty Mexicans with that savage blood in us, that you really hear that kind of stuff sometimes from some of these more, white supremacist extremist groups of this Hispano group. And it can be kind of disturbing because you are part indigenous whether or not you want to accept it. But it is worth pointing out that there is a unique dialect of Spanish that is spoken in this part of the country. With the terrain there being fairly difficult, this area was often isolated from other parts of the Spanish Empire. So if you speak the Queen's Spanish from Spain and you go to this part of the country, you might do a couple of these type things because you're going to hear a few words and a couple of idioms you're not going to really hear in Spain. So now I want to get into the case of someone like my dad, who was a part of a group that I've been mentioning in this video. So here are my parents. My mom is white. She's ginger. When she was younger, she had freckles and red hair. And my dad is mixed race. He is a mestizo, and in his case, he is more indigenous than white. However, for my dad, the Spanish side is actually Basque, so that brings a whole different wrinkle into this whole thing, or the Basque Hispanic. The Basque are a minority group found primarily in north-central Spain, also in southwestern France, but many Basque came along with Spanish settlers in the 18th century to California and interbreeded with the indigenous population there, and the offspring were mestizos. And even though the Basque language itself is nothing like Spanish, most Basque are bilingual, and so a lot of these people, these mestizos that were the offspring, were Spanish speaking. And you come down to today, my dad is Spanish speaking as well. So is he Hispanic? Well, technically he is, because the Basque ancestors were Spanish speaking and came from Spain, even though they were predominantly Basque. But that's just a whole new wrinkle to be thrown onto this convolution of all these different terms we use for people that are coming from different parts of the world that speak Spanish. So this brings up a question: why can't we just use the term brown? It's a term we've been hearing a little more lately. It's usually from people who are Mexican that will call themselves brown. Most Mexicans will say, I'm not Latino or Hispanic, I'm Mexican. Or sometimes you'll start to hear people say brown, and that might seem kind of offensive at first, but we have white folks. I'm white, my mom's white, my dad's brown, my younger brother's brown. We have people who are black. So why can't we just say brown when we already are using white or black? I don't know, but I think that's a perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable term to be using for many of these people that we are using terms like Latino or Hispanic for. So now I want to be my own devil's advocate here and talk about how some of these terms are not really used properly, but another one that we don't use properly is Anglo. The term Anglo simply references being of English descent. However, your name could be Franz Lichtensteigel or Luciano Amoretti, and in the southwestern US, you're an Anglo. So we do tend to use terms like this incorrectly, so is it okay to use some of these other terms incorrectly? Well, I think the term Latino should be retired, especially Latinx, Latinx. I mean, come on, guys. But, I usually use the term Hispanic if I'm trying to be inclusive of people for speaking Spanish, but I usually just use nationality. So I'll say Mexican or Puerto Rican or Cuban or whatever it is, and referencing that group of people, as opposed to trying to be inclusive racially with a term like Latino or Hispanic. Again, it's really more language based, and if you're talking about the individual groups, just use the nationality. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography. I'm talking about stuff like this. I'm talking about cities and states and ranking them in all kinds of different categories. I'm talking about cross-country road tripping, and I'm a bit of a nerd, so everything comes from a more nerdy type perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out.